Hello, and welcome to our webinar on Plastic in the Pines, the case against artificial turf in South Jersey. I'm Heidi Ye. I've been the policy director at Pinelands Preservation Alliance since 2022. And for today's webinar on the case against artificial turf, we'll be talking about the spread of plastic throughout the US and New Jersey, the top 4 reasons why you should say no to artificial turf regardless of where you live, some South Jersey and Pineland specific concerns that we have, and how you can take action. So our organization, we were founded in 1989, and PPA is the leading voice for protecting the natural and cultural resources of the New Jersey Pinelands. Now, artificial turf has been spreading throughout the US, and the Pinelands are no exception. Artificial turf is plastic that is made to look like grass. It may have plastic fibers on top, and then all of these layers underneath that support it. But all of these are synthetic and all come with their chemical concerns. The industry has been greenwashing these as a more eco-friendly alternative to grass. They sell it as low maintenance, low or no water use, and low or no chemical use, such as fertilizer and herbicides. But all of these claims are overstated. Now, to be honest, grass is not always the most green option either. When grown in excess and not managed well, natural grass can cause overuse of water, pollution with herbicides and pesticides, which eutrophies water bodies and causes a loss of biodiversity. Now, this is when it's not done well, and these are the reasons why artificial turf is being sold as green, but not truthfully. However, we believe that with best management practices, natural grass is by far the preferred alternative to artificial turf for recreational use. Now, when it comes to all other uses, fields that you're not running on, we, as an organization, we recommend native landscaping, and we have our landscape makeover program, which educates and encourages residents to turn their lawns of just grass into native plants instead. However, we've been concerned with the spread of artificial turf throughout South Jersey and the Pinelands. Since 2015, at least 9 projects involving artificial turf have been approved by the Pinelands Commission. And ultimately, this demand is being pushed by town council and board of education meetings, where you have people being presented with a false choice between option A, an old schoolyard that was not designed for or that was not designed for high volumes of recreational traffic, and typically does not hold up. You'll see dirt spots that emerge. The grass isn't optimal. And so to deal with all these issues, as well as precipitation, there can be flooding, etc., when it's not actually designed for it, people are being presented with highly engineered artificial turf fields as their only alternative. But little seem to be aware of option C. You could have a well-designed and maintained natural turf field made with natural grass. And each of these options has a very different price tag. So when you're only considering option A or B, it'll be sold as the price difference makes it worth the while, but not knowing that you can achieve similar results for much less if you just properly invest into a natural grass field will result in very big financial difference for towns. So for all of these reasons that are explained throughout this presentation, as well as other webinars that we've done with the Sierra Club and other organizations, we believe that natural grass athletic fields can provide excellent safety, durability, and playing conditions while protecting field users, air, water, soil, and the climate from toxic chemicals and greenhouse gases, but important that it's maintained organically by trained professionals. And one of the previous webinars we did with Keith Fisher, an award-winning field sports manager, he talks about the ins and outs of how to have a really great grass field. So for today's presentation, I'll go over the top 4 most compelling reasons why I think you should reject artificial turf in your towns. First being cost. These numbers come from a previous webinar that we did. You can watch these recordings on YouTube. But when you just look at the initial construction cost of a field, makes sense. The artificial turf cost 2.5 times more than a natural grass field to install. And when we're talking about the natural grass field, this is a very conservative estimate. Many fields don't even need stormwater management systems, but it is always the case with artificial turf since it is an impervious surface. You need, when it rains, to figure out where that water is going to go, whereas the natural grass will naturally absorb it. And now, assuming the following for field personnel are shared across 10 different fields, you might expect to have about half the staff needs for artificial turf fields as natural. So as a result, you have the combined cost of the materials and personnel that you spend on an annual basis is higher for the natural turf, for the natural grass fields. But when you combine these together and look over the course of the 20 years of ownership or more, this we just showed 20 years so that you can see that every 10 years you need to replace the carpet. So there's a little bump in expense there every 10 years with the artificial turf field. That initial expense difference continues throughout the lifetime. So even though it was more expensive to maintain a natural grass field every year, that cost does not outweigh the installation cost. And like I mentioned, conservatively, every decade, more like eight years, you need to replace that carpet that's on top, and that comes with additional recurring expenses. Now, combined together, the construction cost and those carpet replacements, the artificial turf is way more expensive. And then although the annual maintenance is cheaper for artificial turf, that does not undo that big difference that was already caused by the material, the construction itself. And an important thing to note is that when you're investing in the natural grass field, you're really putting that money towards the people. You're investing in people, not just the products. Whereas all that money that's being put into the artificial turf is going to some other company, likely not local, and not contributing to your local community. And that's just for the foreseen costs. There's also unforeseen costs. When you have something that's more expensive, it's more expensive when it gets damaged. So in Ridgewood Village earlier this year, they received less than 2 inches of rain, and that was sufficient to force air bubbles under the artificial turf and force it to bow and bubble when it was exposed to flooding. And this caused over $50,000 in damage to 2 different fields that were affected. And now extreme heat is also a big issue with artificial turf. Paterson, New Jersey, you might have heard earlier, just the other month, that the graduation, they had 2 different ceremonies at which 50 needed to be treated for heat in the morning ceremony, and then 160 in the afternoon ceremony. And then many people were also sent to the hospital. And this was on a day that was not great for holding a graduation. It was 100 degrees Fahrenheit as a high. But since this was held on artificial turf, they were likely experiencing temperatures more like 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit because this graduation was held on artificial turf. A little more on the science of that. So natural grass will be 72 degrees cooler than artificial turf. And then artificial turf is 71 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than air temperature. And that was a study that looked at all the months and all the different weather conditions. So that one was much more inclusive. Mhm. And so with artificial turf fields, we see the urban heat island effect occurring here. So this is just a general phenomenon that we see in developed areas where it's going to be hotter in a city than it is in the surrounding or suburban and rural areas. And this is caused by 3 different things that all are true of artificial turf. So the first is less vegetation. That's a pretty obvious one. You've taken grass, a plant, and replaced it with plastic. And so you're no longer benefiting from evapotranspiration, where as water is evaporating from the leaves of plants, it absorbs heat from the surrounding air and lowers the air temperature. And then the second factor, we all kind of intuitively know this. I'm going to poke fun at my husband. So dark colors tend to be hotter. We went on a summer outing recently, and as soon as he stepped in the sun, he realized, oh, I should not have worn a black shirt today, because they make you feel a lot hotter. And then the inverse of that, when you have lighter things, those tend to be cooler. And buses take advantage of this fact. You'll see most of them are painted white on top, and this can have energy savings of up to 40% because The buses are not as hot and they don't have to spend as much energy on cooling. This is because of albedo, which is the proportion of the incident light or radiation that is reflected by a surface. Light surfaces reflect more, dark surfaces reflect less. And there's quite a big difference between artificial turf and natural grass. You can see that natural is reflecting about a quarter of the energy, whereas artificial turf only 7%, which puts it in the range with asphalt of 5 to 10%. So it has a much lower albedo and it's reflecting less light. And I found that this was really interesting because like both of these fields are green, so what's the big difference? But it turns out that albedo is not just about color, it also depends on the material properties. So artificial turf tends to absorb more of that energy that's coming in, whereas natural grass will scatter it and will not absorb it. And then that third factor for the urban heat island effect, higher heat retention, we see that the rubber or plastic infill that is used to hold those blades of grass upright in the artificial turf field, that they absorb more light than natural soil. So all these factors contribute to the urban heat island effect. So here we're seeing a bird's eye view of the artificial turf field where it's basically asphalt. It is much hotter than everything that's around it. And specifically, we would expect it on a sunny day to be 72 degrees hotter than a natural grass field. So extreme heat is a really big concern, especially for younger populations that are more vulnerable to heat exhaustion, and especially when they are um, taking part in sports and exerting themselves. The artificial turf field is going to exacerbate any adverse outcomes. And this contributes to other emerging health concerns. There are remarkably few studies that exist on the health impacts of artificial turf. We're just kind of assuming that they're safe, but we have a lot of anecdotal evidence showing that the chemicals that were used in artificial turf have been contributing to poor health. Specifically for the Phillies, 6 former Phillies baseball players, they died from the same brain cancer, and they all played at the Vet Stadium, which was known to have AstroTurf during its entire time. And the rate of brain cancer among Phillies who played at the Vet between 1971 and 2003 is about 3 times the average rate among adult men. And it unfortunately led to their passing. And then another great Philadelphia Inquirer series or article, part of a series that they did on AstroTurf and PFAS, the forever chemicals that can be found in artificial turf. They profiled this father who was wondering if the cancer that killed his daughter at the age of 15 could be connected to the artificial turf that she played on for her high school career. And then a University of Washington soccer coach, she noticed after her career of coaching women on these artificial turf fields that a lot of her former players were suffering from cancer. So she kept an informal list of who in my network do I know that has cancer. And she found that almost half of those on her list were goalkeepers. Mhm. So that's kind of a crazy and very compelling finding, I believe, to think that the person that has the most contact with the artificial turf would be suffering from cancer at much higher rates than the rest. Because if you look at your standard soccer team out on the field, you're going to have 10 field players and that one goalkeeper. So if cancer cases were affecting everyone randomly, then you expect less than 10% of your cancer victims to be goalkeepers. But in reality, in her informal anecdotal study of her network, she found that approximately half of the people who were suffering from cancer were goalkeepers, which suggests that their close contact with the artificial turf was increasing their risk of cancer. And now it's important to note that the statistics for rare diseases can be very tricky. People can be exposed to the same things and have very different outcomes, and only a fraction of them will actually suffer from cancer as a result of it. At least that's detected. And we see in the example of Tom's River, really great book by Dan Fagan, where he talks about the science behind the contamination that took place in this town in New Jersey, and all of the statistics and just how difficult it can be to detect a cancer cluster, even when it seems so obvious to people in the community that all of their children are suffering from these rare diseases. So even in a high-profile case like Tom's River, it took 5 years and over $10 million to produce an epidemiological finding that many still only consider a close call when you're just looking at the statistics. And many people are not waiting for these statistics and the science to catch up with that. We have enough science to know that there's a lot of harmful things about artificial turf, and we don't want to be exposing our kids to it. So the Mount Sinai Children's Environmental Health Center, they cite a number of reasons, such as the inconclusive safety data and known chemical hazards, the elevated heat risks and field safety hazards, the heightened vulnerability of children to any of these health risks, and the environmental contamination and climate concerns posed by artificial turf. For all of these reasons, this health center recommends against the installation of artificial turf playing fields. So, because of all of those emerging health concerns. And then finally, what are the consequences of all the production and pollution from this plastic that goes into the artificial turf fields? They may look pretty, but the manufacturing and construction processes for creating them are not. The majority of plastics are produced from ethane that is extracted from the earth through fracking. And so to create an average sized um, artificial turf field, you need over 40,000 pounds of plastic, which is the equivalent of 2 million water bottles. And for the same field, you need 150,000 pounds of crumb rubber. And both of these will degrade and they'll migrate off the field into the environment. If you've ever played on one of these fields, you notice that the infill like gets stuck to your feet and will wash off in any type of rain. And so how much of it is actually being lost on an annual basis? So those grass blades that are made of plastic, the field loses 0.5 to 8% of the blades annually, which can be at least 200 pounds. And then that infill, the sand and the rubber that help to keep the blades upright, 1 to 4% of that infill needs to be replaced annually. Some of that from the migration, some of that from compaction and the field becoming harder over time. And then there's also the question of where does all of this go when at the end of its life cycle, because the plastic carpet on top needs to be replaced every 8 to 10 years. And so the Philadelphia Inquirer did this great article on how the plastic carpets have been piling up on farms. They were promised that there was going to be a recycling factory being built and that they just needed to temporarily store things here. But those companies went bankrupt and left the farms with all of that plastic just sitting on their farms, especially with PFAS that is contaminating the local water supplies as a result. So those are the top 4 reasons why I think you should reject artificial turf regardless of where you live. But here in South Jersey and the Pinelands, we have a few additional concerns, such as surf and turf. What is the impact on our local seafood harvest? What are the impacts to our aquifer? Where is this being disposed of? And what happens when artificial turf burns? So as all those microplastics migrate off of the field and into the environment, that is potentially concerning for South Jersey, where we have many major ports of seafood harvest. And here in this list, we can see the top money makers for seafood production as of the mid 2000s. I tried to use the NOAA database to get more recent data, but they're going through some stuff right now. So at least with this older data, we can see that the majority of sales are being made from filter feeding mollusks, such as sea scallops, clams, ocean quahogs, hard clams, and oysters. And these tend to be consumed whole. And so therefore, humans are ingesting any microplastics that are contained inside of them. I was able to find one study that looks specifically at the plastic from artificial turf and any connections to, in this case, mussels was one of the organisms that they looked at. And this was in China. So they exposed the mussels to aging turf wall particles. And then they found that the mussels were ingesting the finer particles of them. and that even after they let the mussels purge and not eat any new plastic for 3 days, that 44% of those particles that were ingested still remained in the mussels. And now we also got to mention oysters. I love oysters. I did my PhD on them. So they are selective feeders, and they can sort their food to a certain amount, but there is a limit on that. And so my friend Kayla, she was studying mussels and oysters, and she exposed them to microplastic spheres and fibers. And she found that the smaller the particle size, the lower the rejection rate. So they were less able to reject those much smaller particles. And even though you might have large particles starting off, going off of the artificial turf field, these plastics, they just become smaller and smaller over time. They don't really break down, they don't really degrade, they don't turn into something else, they just become smaller and smaller plastic. And so our filter feeders are going to be more susceptible over time as more of these microplastics build up in the environment. Mm-mm. And additionally, what are the impacts to the Kirkwood Cohansey aquifer? Another water impact, but this time on land. This aquifer underlies most of South Jersey, and it is estimated to contain 17 trillion gallons of water. And we can see that any contamination that occurs at the surface, it gets translated down into the lower levels. There are these confining units, but they're not perfectly cut off. There's water that moves between all of these layers that millions of people depend on in South Jersey. And so all these heavy metals can be found in artificial turf. And a lot of that is coming from the recycled rubber that is used as infill for the turf, but also in other layers of the artificial turf. And now a special concern that we have in the Pinelands is that our soil is very acidic. And this impacts the way that those metals from the previous slide are going to move around. So in a normal field circumstance, you might have those metals leaching off of the field and then getting stuck to the soil. So the contamination at least stays local. But in the Pinelands, our soil is acidic, and this makes metals more mobile. So they're less likely to be adsorbed and stick to the dirt. So we are wondering, do pollutants from artificial turf behave differently in pine barren soil? And of course, we'd rather not find that out, but hopefully we'll get a good study on that soon. Where and how are these things being disposed of? I mentioned previously the problem with recycling, that it just does not exist at the moment, and that we already have artificial turf piling up on farms. And in the Pinelands specifically, illegal dumping is a major problem. We see entire house demolitions or um, also smaller house waste and boats and vehicles and things like that. Just a whole range of waste that people don't want to pay to dispose of properly. So they go into the Pinelands and take advantage of the fact that it's so remote to dump their stuff under cover of darkness. So since these carpets need to be replaced every decade, what's to really prevent those from also piling up in the Pinelands as well? Creates a lot of work for PPA and other organizations as we're constantly trying to clean these messes up. And then what happens when it burns? The Pinelands are a fire-prone environment. We need fire as an ecologically healthy thing for our forests. It helps to maintain the unique ecology of the Pinelands. But what are the consequences when you put so much plastic out in the middle of it, have these large fields? So we know that fields can melt between 160 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Fortunately, for a lot of homeowners who opt to put artificial turf on their lawns, they might not find this out until after it's already been installed and find out that they also need to pay for window treatments to help prevent the simple reflection of the sun that will melt their turf. Artificial turf fields are also treated with flame retardants. This helps to slow the ignition, but still doesn't make them flame proof. And also, it's just not great for human health. You don't want to be rolling around in these flame retardants. And they do ultimately burn when it gets hot enough. So in Altadena, California, you can see a picture here of an artificial turf field that was burned. And the consequences when these various components burn. From the crumb rubber, we see release of benzene, styrene, butadiene, and PAHs that are all known or suspected carcinogens. And then from the plastic part of it, we have the release of carbon monoxide, VOCs, and hydrocarbons. And so there's a lot of issues here, but we're left with a devil of a problem where the burden of proof is on advocates like PPA, Sierra Club, not the producers to prove that the harm is here. Otherwise, we are assuming that these things are just safe. And who is or isn't regulating this? At the state level, we have the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. There's currently no restrictions on the use of artificial turf, but given all of the concerns that we have been raising and other members of the public, the DEP has done a series of technical memos where they highlight many of the things that I've mentioned throughout this presentation. Although they don't have the authority at the moment, they would really need legislation to come from the New Jersey Assembly and Senate that would give them the authority to actually act on these things. The thing that is within their power is granting funds to towns to be able to build artificial turf. So currently, as part of the Green Acres program, if you are acquiring open space, if you're improving parks, you can get grants from the Green Acres program to fund an artificial turf as part of it. Given all those concerns that they are aware of, the DEP requires applicants to fill out this addendum that just indicates that you have thought about all these issues. You've thought about extreme heat, you've thought about the microplastic pollution, etc., and that you still want to proceed with an artificial turf field. However, we found that this addendum is quite ineffective, and it feels more like a rubber stamping, since the towns aren't meaningfully engaging with these issues. And now here in the Pinelands, we have the Pinelands Commission, which is an additional level of regulation for anything that is going to be built in the Pinelands. Despite all of our additional protections for the Pinelands, there still have been at least 9 projects involving artificial turf that the Pinelands Commission has approved since 2015. So although many commissioners vote yes to approve these projects, they often grumble afterwards saying that this doesn't make any sense. Why is this in the Pinelands? But they don't feel that they have the authority from the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan to be able to say no. But from May 2025, we have indications that this may be changing. Pinelands Commissioner Rittler Sanchez, she said, "I know I'm not the only commissioner who has serious questions about whether the installation of artificial turf is something that is environmentally sound and in keeping with our protection of the environment here in the Pinelands." And so commissioners do want to have the Pineland CMP changed to give them the authority to regulate this. Now, some commissioners, and we agree that perhaps it currently has the authority to ban artificial turf because part of the law says no development which degrades surface or groundwater quality or which establishes new point sources of pollution shall be permitted. In many ways, we feel that artificial turf already meets this definition, but many commissioners would feel more comfortable if it was explicitly banned in the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan. So they've indicated that in this next year that the staff will be working on this issue. So we hope to see some changes there soon. But in the meantime, there are some actions that your town can take. First, you could place a moratorium on any new artificial turf fields, as Cape May City recently did, partially. So this only applies to landscaping, not recreation, but they did ban artificial turf for the use of landscaping anywhere within their city limits. And then your town could also conduct a thorough cost-benefit analysis of the options and reject specific projects whenever a new field or the replacement of a field is proposed, such as what Princeton did in 2021. And earlier this year, Verona Township did a study as they were considering whether they should replace their existing artificial turf fields or convert to natural grass. And then a third thing that your town can do is ensure that the grass is not greener on the other side by investing in existing natural grass athletic fields. And our previous webinar on natural grass kind of gives you some of the ins and outs on how you can make that happen for your town. So if you, as a resident, are going to your town and asking for these actions, PPA has prepared a handout that you can use with some of these basic facts to help convince your town leaders that they should take action on this. And there's also action that you can take today through the Sierra Club. They have a little form where you can tell your town leaders that you don't want any more artificial turf in your town. And so finally, if anyone has any questions, you can contact me at Heidi@pinelandsalliance.org. And I wish you all a happy plastic-free July.